I say yes to anything else. I hope he doesn't. That'd be hilarious.
What do you got there, boy?
Secret.
Oh,
That's a secret.
all right. Kai, I will see you. Come on in. Middlebury. We're late long Middlebury will be next
Public
year.
knowledge now.
Hmm?
It's public knowledge.
What?
That you don't know right now.
Yeah, I think so, right?
Yeah, it is. I just like you were like hesitant.
Coming in? Good.
No problem.
Yeah. Claire's in there. Claire, where is Presley Brown? Better get over here. Come on in, Miss King. Miss Gorman, and we'll be ready to go. I don't know if I should start without Presley Brown, though. I mean, a day without Presley Brown is a day without Presley Brown. This is day 8, right? I'm going to see if Miss Gorman's on her way. Oh, thought that was Miss Gorman.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I'm sure there will be more. Because I would have filmed.
We're all set, huh? We're waiting on one committee member. One is on maternity leave, will not be here, so.
Yeah.
But what are you doing there, Reed?
Summer reads on Friday. Changing out pictures. Yeah, I did both this year.
We try not to stay with more than 2 years. Well, and then the kids also. Zach, what are you gonna do with your life? Just stay on your phone, just,
You know, I was thinking of,
Waste
starting
your
to track them and just, work KFC.
Well, this is the end of the A1 class, so our last.
Yeah. For the first call finish.
Oh, wow. Never to see that group again.
So,
I don't know, this is, as far as siblings, and I want to say this is at least 12 pairs of siblings I've had in Thesis over the years. I need to do a count.
Yes.
It's at least a dozen. So Again, Olivia's here in spirit, or maybe she'll be watching on YouTube later in Washington. So again, it's been a really, again, this year is full of timely topics, relevant topics, forensic science, a booming field, pop culture, relevancy. I think you're really going to enjoy this presentation. Let's give it up for Claire.
So hi everyone, my name is Claire Hudson, and today I will be presenting my thesis on Presume Nothing, the foundations and future of forensic science. So the purpose of this thesis was basically to look into the history of forensics, look at its modern usages, and what could become of it in the future. There was an abundance of research and sources that were key to the construction of this project, but ethical issues across different fields of forensic science and a textbook of modern toxicology were two of the most notable sources. Both of them helped break down a lot of the complex science behind the different topics to make it more understandable. So what is forensic science? Well, humans are naturally curious about the unknown and seek out forms of justice whenever and wherever we can. Because of this, our tendency to investigate mysterious situations led to the creation of forensic science, which can be defined as the science applied to the interests of justice. We can trace back the very basics of our modern-day forensic investigation all the way to 3rd century China, in a collection of criminal cases titled EUT. In this case, a woman claimed of an accidental house fire killing her husband, and investigators were struck with curiosity after examining the body, after they realized there were no ashes in the husband's mouth. So the coroners decided to test the story by burning 2 pigs, one that was dead and one that was still living. Looking into the mouths of the pigs after they had been burned, it became clear that the woman's story about her husband was inconsistent with the surface-level autopsy performed on her husband, because ashes were present in the mouth of the pig burned alive, but missing in the mouth of the pig killed beforehand. And without a realistic way to bypass the proof, the woman admitted to the murder of her husband. So this case became some of the foundations for a modern-day forensics investigation. Many centuries later, with spurts of growth in the field happening in between, one of the next biggest stepping stones is Matthew Orfila's Treatise on Poisons, which was published in 1818. Orfila's publication of his research covered the most important toxins and how they would react with human skin and organs. He broke down the different groups of poisons into 4 different classifications: irritating, narcotic acid, and septic. And he also provided a list of how each group you would be able to treat each group. This work made this expertise more respected and became the foundations for our modern-day toxicology practices. Quite possibly one of the biggest leaders in forensic advancements during the late 19th to early 20th century was Sherlock Holmes. The character was created by Arthur Doyle in 1887 as one of the most successful fictional detectives of the time. What makes Doyle's work so interesting, however, is how ahead of the times the fictional techniques Holmes used were. Doyle was a novel forensic and criminalistic writer with an ability to implement forensic techniques into his work that were yet to be discovered and implemented in real-world situations. In fact, almost every modern-day technique that is routinely used today was first mentioned and expanded in a case fictionally solved by Holmes. For example, a study in Scarlet discovered a new, more reliable way to test for the identification of blood using hemoglobin known as the Sherlock Holmes test. Not 15 years later, after it was published fictionally, the spectroscopic method was created. This method was built on similar foundations of hemoglobin that the Sherlock Holmes test was. And even if Doyle and Holmes were not given credit for creating these techniques in fiction before they were born in the real world, it can be seen time and time again that Doyle wrote them into existence in a way. So forensics is a field that encompasses hundreds of expertises that all come together to aid in this fight for justice. In this thesis, it was broken down into 3 broad categories: forensic science, forensic psychology, and digital forensics. To start, forensic science is one of the most complex and diverse areas of forensics. There can be evidence found in even the most unthinkable parts of a crime scene. Discussed before with Matthew Orfila, toxicology has been one of the earliest foundations in forensic science. Forensic toxicology is the exercise of toxicology that as it relates to a criminal and murder case where poisons and toxins have been administered explicitly to cause adverse effects in the victim. Trace evidence is another expertise that is held in high regard in the field of forensics. Trace DNA is the identification and comparison of materials that could be transferred from one surface to another during a crime. One great example of the usage and the importance of this technique is seen in the Atlanta child murders. So the murder of 28 people in Atlanta, Georgia between the years of 1979 and 1981 left investigators speculating possible offenders for years. Different witnesses spoke out about how, coincidentally, two of the victims were both seen with the same man last before they disappeared. And Wayne Williams was tried and found guilty for 2 counts of murder. But it wasn't until the early 2000s that even more disappearances were connected to Williams. In the case of the Williams murders, one of the main pieces of evidence that led to the connection between victim and attacker was strands of carpet fiber. During examinations of the many murder victims found within the span of Williams' criminal activity, investigators took note of a coarse, yellow-greenish, coarse carpet fiber. Determining the manufacturing company that produced the carpet thread would be something that would help narrow down the scope of suspected houses. When companies could not be determined, the fiber analysis road had come to a dead end for the time being. But that was until a surveillance van witnessed a man driving away from the James Parkson Parkway Bridge before a loud splash in the dead of night, a vehicle that was later connected to Williams. Search warrants allowed for investigation teams to search Williams' home for any evidence, and in his home, they found the same unique carpet fibers. And with further investigation, he was found guilty of these crimes as well. What's more, cases such as these emphasize the importance for growth in the forensic field by conveying how modern advancements in forensics has made it possible for past unsolvable cases to be solved. Another common example of trace DNA collection and analysis is swabbing. The combination swab method of dry swabbing and wet swabbing is favored for crime scene DNA extraction. This technique can easily be performed with limited risks of contamination from external and unrelated DNA. DNA and fingerprints left on fabric material are better collected through tape strips pressed over the targeted area. So setting and circumstance of a crime is highly critical to note as forensic scientists create a plan for approaching the collection of trace DNA. One successful example of this is seen in the Anna Palmer case. So the murder of 10-year-old Anna Palmer in 1998 was trapped at a dead end when technology and knowledge lacked the depth it required to find an attacker. 13 years later, modern technological evolution made it possible for investigators to use instrumental DNA analysis techniques to work past what stomped out their attempts years before. 0 witnesses, 0 suspects, and 0 visible evidence. Pieces of fingernails from Anna Palmer were collected, swabbed, and analyzed, looking for traces of DNA that belonged to anyone except for herself. Foreign skin cells were found under her fingernails and were linked to a man named Matthew Breck, who, upon further investigation, was currently serving a separate 10-year sentence for a different sexual crime against another child. Next, we're going to look into the usage of forensic psychology. So forensics typically deals with concrete evidence and known science to provide supporting information. But gray areas may hinder investigators when scenarios arise that when they question a potential suspect, when they're given no physical leeways on why a suspect committed the crime that they did. That is where forensic psychology and criminal profiling comes into play. Criminal profiling can be defined as a multidisciplinary understanding of criminology, medical examination, and psychiatry, with the purpose of gathering information in the context of a crime that may help identify the type of criminal who committed said crime. This information and evidence can be found through cognitive tendencies, behavioral patterns, motivation, emotional disposition, and demographic variables of an unknown offender based on characteristics and evidence gathered at the scene of the crime. Generating a criminal profile takes into account countless details. There are multiple different approaches one could take when creating a profile, And over the recent years, the generating process has been standardized into 6 basic steps. Phase 1 begins with gathering data. Phase 2 organizes all the input and data collected from Phase 1. Phase 3 is where the actual profile begins to generate. Phase 4 compares the profile to possible suspects. Phase 5 is the construction of a profile report. And finally, Phase 6 is where the suspects will be compared to the criminal profile. Those steps are only one way that investigators may choose to tackle creating a criminal profile. Profilers occasionally are able to look into criminal behavioral tendencies across crimes and link those traits together to lead them to a possible perpetrator. The uncovering and classification of serial homicidal behaviors and personation aids investigators in this. Personation and behavioral patterns can include methods of body destruction, techniques for hiding the body, aggression, sexual intent, removed or placed objects, threatening notes, and emotional scarring. One of the most popular cases at the moment that has been a huge success for forensic psychologists is the famous Jack the Ripper case. Jack the Ripper was an anonymous serial killer who went on a killing spree in 1800s East End, England. What makes this case so engrossing is the convincing cover stories and choice for location that were able to give Jack the ability to disappear without a trace. Something that is important to note about this case is the current events during the time period in which the murders took place. Many medical students were required to dissect at least 2 entire corpses due to the Medical Act of 1858. This new requirement led to a rise of the body dealer network. Now, it was perfectly legal for people to supply hospitals with a corpse. However, what was illegal was to profit off of these bodies. Nevertheless, the most discreet body dealers were able to keep a low profile and become experts at cover stories, allowing them to further profit off of this industry. It's also important to note of the eerily clean dissection skills Jack possessed. Each of the bodies were found with lacerations on their neck from ear to ear, which effectively cut their voice box. Secondly, each of the bodies were found with a slash on the victim's torso, giving Jack accessibility to all the profitable organs that he could sell. The precision of the dissection of these bodies seems too well practiced for them to be done by anyone other than somebody with medical training. And repeating behaviors such as these allow for forensic experts to make links between cases, create a psychological profile, and reduce the list of potential suspects. Yet that is not where the extent of forensic psychologist expertise and role ends. It is natural to wonder why criminals carry out the acts that they do, and that is why we have the study of evolutionary forensic psychology. Damaging victims physically, mentally, and economically is a common practice individuals use to obtain revenge or get what they want out of a situation. Criminal action is naturally ingrained in our psychology from centuries of evolution in a dog-eat-dog society. And while the study is not a toleration for crimes, it is a recognition that crimes are manifestations of evolutionary recurrent conflicts and could revolutionize our understanding of criminal behavior. Forensic psychology does not yet have a known path for the future of forensics, but so far it has opened new doors for forensics research and brought us a step closer to a universal truth. Moving on to the next category, we will look into digital forensics. This is considered as a new branch of forensics compared to all the other units. Digital forensics has quickly become one of the most important aspects of forensics, especially in the 20th and 21st century. Digital forensics has forced the criminal justice system and forensic investigative process to evolve and adapt with the new medium of evidence. Generally, the steps taken by digital forensic experts can be divided into 3 steps: collection, preservation, and analysis. Collection of digital evidence and how it is labeled plays a significant role in the route taken for the investigation process. To aid investigators with the high amounts of cyber push-through, automated processes have been created to help aid investigators with certain early stages of the investigation process. The main goal of preservation is to gain and maintain access to view, retrieve, and use digital collections. Like all other areas of forensics, there are multiple ways to analyze a piece of digital evidence. One method of analysis is through hash functions, a complex software that sifts through large amounts of digital data. It compares different inputs and filters through duplicate files. It is the go-to technique for investigating large volumes of data and used to validate data integrity because of its memory retention and high throughput. Secondly, dealing with the issue of data recovery, file carving is a favorite technique for analysts. File carving is a recovery technique that allows for data and files to be restored, even when corrupted. It plays a vital role in the forensic case working with digital evidence involving deleted or corrupted data, unknown systems, and tampered systems. Digital forensics comes with its own unique set of challenges. Although growth in cybersecurity has nurtured integrity and justice digitally, determination for individuals to create approaches to slide past these techniques has grown alongside it. The primary purpose of anti-forensic techniques are to avoid detection, disrupt information collection, and increase forensic investigation time by any means possible. Technological advances come at an incredibly fast rate, leaving crime labs and investigators little time to keep up with this growing unit. And with anti-forensic techniques growing so quickly, growth in this field of expertise has much needed room for improvement. Forensic science has never been more popular than it is right now, and it's growing at a fast rate compared to how fast it has grown in the past. Much of this growth has to deal with the popularization of the field. Popular TV shows such as CSI Crime Scene Investigation and Forensic Files has brought this field to the attention of many people. Recent popularity has allowed for more light to be shed on the importance of these developments and allowed them to be expanded further. For example, one of the latest up-and-coming techniques is forensic microbiome application. The study of bacteria, viruses, and other microorganisms from a particular environment and geographic location has been used to understand how changes in personal routine can affect our autoimmune health. Bacterial DNA is affected by an individual's lifestyle and behavioral patterns. So not only with more research and testing could this technique allow for investigators to determine the host's general geographic location, but it could also possibly allow them to create a personalized lifestyle profile for said host. The second up-and-coming technique is forensic paleontology. This is an application of the study of pollen and spores, often used to establish links between objects, people, and places. Paleontology is a useful tool that could potentially provide supporting evidence for claims of a victim or attacker's location. Whilst these fields still need a great deal of supporting research, a technique this promising so early on cannot be overlooked. As I've stated, the field is far from done growing, and as the field continues to expand and its techniques become more complex, more controversies become apparent. Data legitimacy of said techniques for many brings into question ethics and morals of crime lab protocols. One scientific dilemma and ethical controversy is the issue of what is done with genetic samples after their intended use as evidence. DNA databases have become a popularized idea between crime labs, aiding with suspect identification and crime linking. But DNA usage has been an extremely useful technique so far. But some worry that the retention of DNA information will be misused and become a means of aiding unprofessional forensic scientists in their own personal intentions, such as racial labeling, evidence planting, and so on. There will always be those looking to use principled tools for their own unprincipled purposes. And for that reason, it is the job of the forensic experts to protect the integrity of forensic science. With the implementation of more rigid standards, investigators work with a second or maybe even a third pair of eyes. Possibly the most popular digital issue is the debate between users' rights to privacy and concerns about digital safety. It is a thin line that separates protecting and violating, because allowing total digital confidentiality in all situations risks guaranteed rampages of cybercrime. However, total freedom for digital investigators to search all types of digital information leaves people feeling stripped of their security their rights to privacy offer. Putting complete trust in technology is difficult for a large portion of the population, and that is a completely valid concern. However, with technology taking over every aspect of the modern world, if forensics does not follow suit in creating new digital tools, it will not stand a chance. Especially when it comes to psycholegal forensics, psychologists who work with court testimonies, confidentiality seems to be a back and forth battle. Confidentiality is extremely important to preserve the trust people have in the forensic system. But if the forensic psychologist understands that what is best for the client is not something that they have agreed to disclose to the court. As a professional with the right competence and credentials, they simply want what is best for the client and the case in the long run. However, also as a professional, they should be understanding of their client's hesitance and keep said information confidential. It is a difficult decision to make in some cases between aiding their client's case or following their client's wishes. Something that comes as a surprise and a worry for most people is the fact that forensic professionals all across the United States do not have a set national code of ethics. There are hundreds of code of ethics in different regions with unique qualities about them. However, all of them do have one thing in common, and that is a call for ethical decision-making. A code of ethics can provide a guide that minimizes confrontation regarding issues of ethics investigators may stumble upon. But the dispute begins when we realize not everyone has the same idea of what is considered ethical. A code of ethics and a set standard and a formal code of ethics may raise the comfort people feel putting their trust in forensic science and leaving it to be the deciding factor for social justice. Without a consistent code that forensics experts can lean back on, the field loses much of its credibility. Many are actually committing their entire careers to aid in the ethics battle. The Innocence Project, for example, is an organization that helps with keeping forensic ethics and morals in check, working to prevent wrongful convictions and promote equitable systems of justice for everyone in the criminal system. So why is forensics important? Without knowing it, since the very beginning of our forensics journey in 3rd century China, or maybe even before then, we have been set on a path towards social justice. The positive impacts of forensic science has on our society can not only be seen through bringing justice to victims of violent crimes through the uncovering of their attacker's identity, but it can also be seen through the closure it offers some families. For example, efforts are being made to identify 9/11 victims with next-generation sequencing technologies and offer closure for families who still are missing closure. So looking forward, the possibility of growth forensics has is immeasurable. Forensics could flourish alongside our natural curiosity and stand for justice. Its already great success would be a shame to ignore. We must let the field grow, take precautions where needed, run tests until outcomes are consistent, and figure out ways to implement technologies ethically. Experts must research intensively and take advantage of its possibilities it offers until the human limitation of complexity is reached. Then begs the question, what comes next? This is just the adolescence of forensics and what it will become. What is groundbreaking then is foundational basics now, and what is revolutionary now will soon be elementary. Thank you.
Are there any cases in particular you wish you could have spent more time on and done a deep dive on, like contemporary cases in the criminal justice system or anything?
There were a couple that I thought were super interesting, but I couldn't put into my slides. For example, one of them was known as the Craigslist killer, who lured people into like his killing area by Craigslist, and they eventually solved that mystery through toxicology. But I never got to go super into it because I didn't have enough time. But that would definitely be one that I would want.
Out of the areas digital psychology field, what did you find most interesting and engaging?
I actually really enjoyed researching about forensic psychology. It's kind of like a rabbit hole. You could just like keep researching about it and keep finding new things about it. So there's like an endless loop of new sources available to you to read on it, and it's just so interesting to read about how people or how forensic investigators can figure out different crimes just through the psychology of a person.
I've got a couple more, but I'm gonna turn over the board.
Okay, wonderful job. I'm so proud of you. I'm a crime junkie, and we talk a lot about all the different podcasts or Netflix shows that I've seen, and then we swap things back and forth. I was interested, with the popularity of forensics with the masses, from all these podcasts and shows and things. We've got a rise of armchair detectives and crowdsourcing investigative reports work. So what implications do you think this has on the field in terms of the professional ethics and the quality of investigative processes? Do you see, one kind of the masses helping the professionals make sure and do things better or differently?
Yeah, I definitely think the recent popularity has definitely, the field has definitely gained a lot of attention, and so it's been able to research more with new donations being made. So it's definitely a good thing that helps with our understanding of the forensics field. But there is also some downside to it. The CSI effect, which I didn't get to talk about, is basically with all these new shows coming out about the criminal justice system and the forensics field, people think it's a lot easier to solve a case than it actually is. And so people expect for results to be found extremely quickly when it actually many times takes weeks or months, sometimes years.
Is there a group, an organization, uprising, whatever, of professionals who are working on developing this code of ethics and bringing, more consistency to the field?
I definitely think the Instance Project helps a lot with that, since I feel like it's one of the bigger groups that more people know about in the forensic field. I'm not sure about a whole organization, but I do know that multiple different crime labs and different, like the American Forensic Psychologists Association has put together a possibility or different ideas for a national code of ethics. And so many different groups like that have put together their own code to kind of let other people give some advice on, try to help build one. But I don't think any of that has really been taken a step into like a more set code.
Well, thank you. Great job.
Good job, Claire. Proud of you for finishing up. I have a comment and then a couple of questions then about the CSI effect. It's also been problematic in terms of prosecution, because like jurors nowadays expect you'll have DNA evidence for every crime, and they don't, these armchair forensic people don't really realize how difficult it is to get that kind of biological data for prosecution purposes. I wanted to ask you one question about kind of the history of forensics. So you did a really good job explaining the fields that have been around forever, like document analysis, which you didn't talk about in the presentation, and toxicology and things like that, and talking about things that are up and coming, like the digital analysis and microbiome studies. Were there any fields of forensics in your studies about the history of the field that have fallen out of favor and aren't used anymore?
One that I can think of right now, lie detection. It used to be a lot bigger of a unit than it is now, just because a lot more people have found that it's unreliable and they just don't trust it as much. And so people have kind of just pushed it aside. And some cases still do use them, but you won't see it being used as the main source of evidence for any case.
Another one is bite analysis. Like there used to be people that they were specialists, and like if there was a bite on a body, they could compare it to dental records. Oh yeah, that's definitely our guy. But what they found in the years since is that's really not terribly accurate. So we don't really do that kind of stuff anymore.
I got a Netflix show that I can share to you about that.
And then I have kind of an ethical question for you. So, and we talk about this in biology sometimes about like who owns your DNA information. Like if I decide to do 23andMe or Ancestry.com, should those companies be able to share that data, my personal DNA data, with investigators? Should it require a warrant or not? And then the flip side of that is, what if I get investigated for a crime and the police now have my DNA data on file? Should they be allowed to sell it to, say, like my health insurance company. And, now my health insurance company might know that I have a history of diabetes in my family or whatever and choose not to cover me anymore. So what do you think about like that sharing of your personal DNA data, and where should we draw the lines?
The issue with DNA sharing is there's a position for almost like every single idea. So whatever like a national code may decide to, wherever they decide to draw the line, still not everyone's going to be happy with that. Personally, since not everyone is going to be happy, I think it would be best to try and make it, I won't say as open as possible, but being able to let individuals choose whether or not they would be comfortable with like 23andMe sharing their genetic information with other private businesses or third-party companies. I definitely think that should be an option, because if they don't mind it being shared, then that's great. But if they do mind it being shared, then that's also fine. But yeah, it's just a really difficult.
Any of y'all done that?
I have not done it because I don't want to
I'm saying, but like my son was born with a birth defect, and the CDC was doing a study to determine if it was environmentally caused or genetically caused. And so they asked us to do the cheek swab, me and my husband and the baby. And we did, because I'm a scientist. It was a science fair experiment, really. And so, my DNA is already out there. But I hope the CDC is keeping it private and, we'll never share it with my health insurance company or whatever, because I don't know what might be in there. I mean, because, I've never done 23andMe or Ancestry because of that issue of privacy. And my last question is, so now that you've studied all this, do you watch forensic TV shows? And if so, what kind of grade would you give them for accuracy? Good question.
Right now I'm watching like Forensic Files and all that. And that's kind of why I put it like in the paper, just because it's like my favorite one so far. I don't know. I think it's like, well, a lot of the Forensic Files cases are from like a long time ago. But for back then, I would say they're pretty accurate. And sometimes they like take a case that happened like 40 years ago and bring it into like modern day when it could be solved. So I'd say it's pretty, at least that show is pretty accurate.
Awesome. Good job.
Ms. King?
Yeah, I'd like to echo, I think you did a fantastic job with your presentation, and I'm proud of you. Are there people who advocate for like a national like DNA registry or anything that kind of just, it's like everybody's is out there and there's like a national?
Yeah, there definitely are groups of people and individuals who believe that having like a nationwide or even a worldwide genetic database would be extremely beneficial to being able to solve different cases or even different crimes. So there are definitely people who do want to see that in the future, but I don't know if the people who do want to see it outweigh the people who don't.
Yeah, a lot of states have their own database, but like if someone commits a crime in another state, it's not that jurisdiction can necessarily get that information. So it's kind of hard to put all the pieces together right now because there's not a national database. But I totally use that to brighten my child. I'm like, you better never commit a crime because government's already got your DNA, Andy.
Within the realm of forensic psychology, are there experts who try to take into account things like mental illness or even cultural variations, things like autism, as they're building these profiles? I mean, how much expertise are they utilizing in these areas to make sure that they're kind of understanding these profiles?
Yeah, I mean, they take into account hundreds of different aspects, mental health and like cultural factors definitely do play into that. The mental health sector of forensic psychology and how it plays into a criminal profile definitely does need to be researched more. I don't think it's as big of a factor in criminal profiles as other things, like different behavioral consistencies within crimes. It's definitely something that they have started to research, but it's definitely not something as researched as other things. But it would be good to see it.
Okay. Audience, we have time for a few questions.
Like just kind of reading a lot of
headlines, I noticed that a lot of the Innocence projects, a lot of the foundation of their exonerations is DNA based. So what ways do you think like a DNA database or like the lifeline of crime labs holding DNA could help in like overturning those convictions? Because if we do, say that once a crime lab has DNA, like then it has like discarded it or like not have information anymore, like how could that potentially harm projects like the Innocence Project? Yeah, DNA databases definitely have helped and been extremely beneficial for the Innocence Project because as our DNA analysis techniques become more complex, we're able to better distinguish between two different people's DNA. And so keeping a sample of everyone's genetic information could definitely be beneficial to go back and look through to just make sure that a case was correct. But then also the issue comes with the expenses of having to collect and then keep everyone's genetic information correct. But it definitely does have an extreme benefit for the Innocence Project. And I hear some.
So I know you cut a lot from this presentation. What's your favorite thing that ended on the cutting room floor that could make a presentation?
I mean, I really found it interesting about the Sherlock Holmes thing that he was actually like one of the most influential forensic investigators during the late 19th to early 20th century. I just think it was so interesting how Doyle was able to actually write in extreme detail all these different techniques that, just a couple of years later were actually found to be true. And I think that's just super interesting. But I also really found the 9/11 victim identification with next generation sequencing to be, pretty like heartwarming, honestly. Just to know that forensic science is still being used to help create like a better social environment.
One more question real quick. Cost benefit analysis. How much money are they pouring into this? And are they reaping the benefits, or is it to the point where this is going to be so expensive to maintain and to upgrade that cities, counties, states won't be able to, afford this?
It's costs of forensic techniques definitely are an issue, and obviously they've gotten a lot more expensive and more complex techniques have become. But with the popularization of these things and of like crime scene TV shows, which have brought more attention to it, and also with the popularization of the Innocence Project, more funds have been donated to different crime labs, locally or nationally, to help kind of aid in that economic factor.
All right.
Oh, you guys have to check it out. I just had another question. Wait, Claire, very informally. Has like the proliferation of like CSI crime shows made people smarter? Yeah. I mean, like, obviously it's a good thing that there's been a popularization of this field and more content added, but with that also comes shows that are more in-depth, like forensic files that goes through like different steps. I mean, forensic techniques, it's definitely kind of like everybody has theirs, so they kind of
Good job. I watched online.
online outside? Or you're watching online outside the door?
Okay, because of stats, if
Yeah.
I'm watching online.
I was watching.
Ready?
Yeah. Here, 1, 2, 3. Now over here. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, one was Claire alone.
Okay.
Yeah. Good job, Claire. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
All right.
Fabulous job. Very
Yeah,
good.
Claire. Let's get an A1. Claire.
Oh, A1.
Yeah.
Green class.
They're in the middle.
A1. Last A1 ever.
Okay,
Oh, God. I keep dropping things.
Okay.
ready? 1, oh, now for the letter.
I'll go.
Wait, there you
Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
go. Oh. All right.
Real
Sorry.
Oh, those are the cards.
Ready? Over here? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
Well.
Oh, did you guys know
All
that?
right.
This is possible for the board? Do you want to get one?
Yeah, family. Perfect. I thought about the bike. You know, I put it, and I was thinking about that.
He scratched me.
I thought he did. Easy question.
Oh, he hit my leg.
Okay.
He scratched my arm. Okay,
Okay.
ready? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. I got it.
All right. Hey, you like it? What are we waiting? Right on.
You're gonna do great.
Not here. She's on the. I don't think Vaughn's gonna be here. How about Sam? Okay, thank you. Okay. Well, she definitely gave her the day. We remind her all.
Oh, right. Oh, my God. Sorry.
What?
She was, have you already downloaded the weekend?
Go to share Promethean on Google.
It is share dot mypromethean.com. Yes, you'll just pull up your slideshow. What's it? Yeah, there is a little bit of a delay.
Yes, God. Yeah, we have 6 more. Six. If you look at it, probably 2 minutes to see. I knew. News flash yet. talking about their schedule for next week. Check this. Obviously, another timely topic. Probably, if I was ranking areas that I'm most passionate about, interested in, this probably would be number one. As far as something that I've invested my own time into, obviously with our amnesty chapter dealing with this issue several years ago, and I think something that does not necessarily get enough attention in the media. Human rights topics are always very timely and relevant, and this, I think, issue has been, again, buried sometimes. Maybe it's because of the power of the Chinese state, and as they grow in power, I think more groups are going to be marginalized, and I'm glad Brown is taking this task on and to profile and highlight this important issue. Let's give it up for Aaron. No, I don't think it's been. I didn't hear back from him, so.
Okay. Alright, I'll just. So my name is Ram Majid, and I'll be presenting over my honors senior thesis titled "The Uyghurs in China: A Cultural Genocide." And so I used a variety of books throughout the majority of my writing process. And so the first book, Eurasian Crossroads by James Millward. He's a professor who specializes in Qing, Chinese, and Central Asian history. His book was used to establish the history of the Uyghur people and their role in Chinese society. Additionally, the next book, Xinjiang and the Modern Chinese States, written by Justin Jacobs, was also used to cover the Uyghurs' history and relevance to the nation of China, as well as how the population became a part of the country. And so these two books on the right were used for the more modern aspects of the Uyghurs, The War on the Uyghurs by Sean R. Roberts and Transfer on People by Nick Holdstock, and they were vital in understanding the abuses that the Uyghurs currently face in China today. And so I also used many newspapers throughout my research, and the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Guardian were the three that were most recurring throughout my entire process. And so all these sources provided a great personal insight to the experience of the Uyghur people within the Xinjiang province through hands-on journalism and personal interviews. This paper could not be possible without. I also used a variety of journalistic articles, the majority of which I used the JSTOR database to find. And so moving on to the actual thesis itself. So who are the Uyghur people? Well, the Uyghur people are an ethnic minority, a Turkic ethnic group originated from the Xinjiang autonomous region within China. Now, typically, when you think of Chinese people, you're thinking of Han Chinese people. But the Uyghurs are completely separate people who have a completely separate look. They sound completely different, and they act completely different. They also have their own unique culture, as well as language, which differs from the typical Han, and the majority of the population is Muslim. And so in order to understand this, you have to go all the way back to the Silk Road, which is a land-based trade route that stretched over 4,000 miles. And this connected traders from Western Europe to China. And this wide path allowed for the mass communication of ideas and culture at a rate never seen before in history. And so while the Silk Road served many purposes, it was mainly known for its ability to spread religion, specifically Islam. And so, however, the Tang dynasty, who controlled China at the time, were very good at keeping Islam outside of the region's influence. But this led to many regions around it, such as the kingdom of Kashgar, eventually picking up on Islam and adopting it. And this kingdom was home to many of the Uyghur people, which is essentially how the Uyghurs came to become Muslim and how their identity and culture is essentially shaped. So decades later, the Qing dynasty would eventually move in and occupy the region in the 1750s. And they would use a system of indirect rule until the Uyghurs rebelled in the 1860s. However, this freedom was short-lived, and the dynasty returned again with an aggressive military campaign in the 1880s, marginalizing the Muslim population afterward, favoring a more direct system of rule. And this would continue onward until the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911 and the rise of the Republic of China in 1912. And during this time, a succession of 3 leaders would be appointed, each of which would implement stricter policies than that of their predecessors. And this would obviously lead to anger and resentment among the Uyghur population. The last leader, Chiang Shika, had banned many religious activities and pilgrimages and even imposed heavy taxes on the locals. And because of this, many revolts arose, and being unable to deal with them, the Republic of China was forced to leave the region. And so now that they were under no outside leadership, the Uyghurs set up their own independent nation that would soon become known as the Eastern Turkestan Republic. And on November 12th, 1944, this would last for around 5 years, and it would mark a period of peace and prosperity for the Uyghur people, as they were now free to practice their religion and express their culture due to the lack of oppressive overlords who had attempted to stifle the population. However, this would soon come to an end as Mao Zedong, a communist revolutionary and chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, eventually comes to power in 1949. And he takes the land once ruled by the Republic of China. Once he was in power, he decided to negotiate with the leaders of the Eastern Turkestan Republic through a meeting which had been set up by brokers in Moscow. Now, within this meeting, the leaders of the Eastern Turkestan Republic had agreed to facilitate the movement of the People's Liberation Army into the region. And afterward, the 5 leaders were then invited to meet with Mao Zedong in Beijing as well. However, unfortunately, the 5 leaders of the Eastern Turkestan Republic were then killed in an alleged plane crash, which was most likely planned. But now the region was left without any central authority figure, and the People's Liberation Army was already in place to take over the region, leading Mao to eventually enter the next Xinjiang province. And so, as Mao came to power in Xinjiang, he began to implement restrictive policies as he viewed religion as a political source of instability. He believed that the previous Chinese rule over the region had fallen due to their religion's overpowering influence over the system of governance that the Chinese had eventually put in place. And so one of his signature policies that he used was the Bingtuan, also known as the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, which essentially was used to both incentivize and force Han Chinese migration into the area, so as to subvert the power that the majority Uyghur group held at the time. And so the CCP especially valued 2 groups of Han migrants: urbanites for education and skilled labor, and peasants for endlessly exploitable labor. And so these policies were very effective and resulted in a population split in 1953 of 75% Uyghur and 6% Han Chinese to move to just 54% Uyghur and 35% Han in just a decade. And so in just a short period of time, Mao was able to disrupt the ethnic balance of the region. And so later in 1956, Mao Zedong implemented the 100 Flowers movement, where Chinese citizens were encouraged to criticize the Chinese Communist Party. However, when the Uyghurs spoke out against their unfair treatment, the CCP quickly started the religious reform campaign as a result. During the campaign, the CCP dismantled multiple Uyghur religious institutions and cracked down on Islamic practices, criminalizing them. Immediately following this campaign was the Great Leap Forward, in which collectivization policies were carried out en masse. In addition, Islam continued to be attacked as mosques were turned over to the state and bazaar festivals were banned. These policies would only continue to worsen in 1966 come the Cultural Revolution. So the Cultural Revolution would essentially focus on eradicating Uyghur culture and successfully destroying many Uyghur cultural and religious institutions, temporarily curtailed the use of Uyghur language in official documents, broke up communities and social capital, and fostered an uneducated generation of Uyghurs who had no sustained access to education, which started the process of systematic disenfranchisement. So focusing on Uyghur culture also meant the CCP would eventually target Islam, which had historically been practiced throughout the region. As a result, many religious observances were stifled during the Cultural Revolution, mosques were destroyed, and others lost much of their land and buildings. So as Han migration continued into Xinjiang, the invading population mainly settled in the north, where they began to urbanize the region without the inclusion of the Uyghurs. As cities and new economic sectors were being developed, many Uyghurs were left systematically disenfranchised, not only due to the sudden urbanization, but also thanks to the policies that had been enacted during the Cultural Revolution. On the other hand, in southern Xinjiang, many Uyghurs still remained largely agriculturally based, but would soon face economic fallout due to the rapid advancement of the Han Chinese and the success of the Bingtuan policy. Now, following the events of the Tiananmen Square in 1976, CCP policy began to become even more stricter across the entire nation. Many Uyghurs who had experienced freedom under the Eastern Turkestan Republic almost 3 decades ago had now wished for the same autonomy once more. As a result, Uyghur separatist movements began to rise. Although the majority of these movements were largely peaceful, a small minority soon began to turn towards violence. And in 1990, Uyghur separatists would soon occupy 3 government buildings in what would now be known as the Bear Incident. And so after these separatists were killed or arrested, the CCP intended to use this event as an excuse to crack down even further on the region, arresting over 1,800 Uyghurs in just the next 5 years under the pretext of supporting separatist movements. This, however, only angered the Uyghur population, allowing for separatist movements to continue to gain traction. In 1992, even more violent acts such as bombings carried throughout the region in 5 major non-dominated cities would take place. Rather than continuing to reinforce the security campaign the CCP had once started, the officials in the region began to turn towards new strategies. And you would see this in 1996 with the leaking of document number 7, which recorded that the PRC strategy for suppressing Uyghur religiosity and calls for self-determination had soon become systematic as opposed to just using security pressure. And so the paper explicitly focused on 2 separate goals. One was for the first goal was for the CCP to push for increased economic development and prosperity in the region only within Han-dominated cities, so as to continue to systematically disenfranchise the Uyghur population. And the second was to institute more counter-aggressive measures against the Uyghur dissenters. And so we would see this as the Uyghurs would continue to be economically left behind as investments in the region would soon triple in the 90s. Chinese officials, domestic and international investors organized the region's abundance of resources, oil, natural gases, and metals, leading to even more expenditure in the area. Businesses and new economic sectors were disproportionately harmed, leading the Uyghurs to be powerless in their own home. As tensions continued to grow, another attack would occur in 1997, where separatists were able to organize 3 bus bombings in Xinjiang's capital city of Urumqi. As the CCP continued to crack down on the Uyghurs' population under the guise of fighting separatism, a new opportunity would present itself that would completely change the way that they approached the region. That would be 9/11. So following the events of 9/11, the Chinese Communist Party was able to exercise complete control over the Xinjiang province through restrictions on religion, culture, freedom of expression, and the media. In addition, the introduction of a new economic sector to the region, which intended to make full use of natural resources, was concentrated in the north, where the population was made up of 88% Han Chinese. Meanwhile, the Uyghur-dominated southern half was experiencing little economic change and was unable to take advantage of these newly implemented policies. So the gap between these 2 populations continued to widen at alarming rates, and tensions began to rise as a result. However, at the same time, the Chinese government was also taking advantage of the United States' war on terror by enacting new policies under the name of counterterrorism and assimilation to continue to harass and detain the Uyghur population. And so this rising animosity would eventually result in a series of riots breaking out, which would later be known as the 2009 Urumqi riots. Sparked by an online rumor of Uyghur workers sexually assaulting a Han woman, which was later disproved. 2 Uyghur factory workers were killed. And so, angered by the death of these workers, close to 1,000 Uyghur students gathered in the streets of Urumqi as so angered, and they started a protest, which quickly turned violent. And police intervention and Han Chinese counter-protests also started as a result, and over 197 deaths were formed by all 3 sides. So naturally, the Chinese Communist Party would immediately pounce on the riots, hungry for any reason to punish or continue oppressive policies against the Uyghur population. And now even those who were more hesitant to place restrictive policies were soon convinced after the events in Urumqi. And so as the CCP continued to implement more restrictive policies within the region, Uyghur separatist movements continued to grow, which was counterproductive to their task. And so eventually, the CCP would turn toward this man, Chen Guangguo, and he was pretty much in charge of Tibet from 2011 to 2015, where he was able to effectively stifle the voices of resistance and restore stability to the Tibet region. And so, inspired by his actions, President Xi Jinping recognized his ability and relocated him to the Xinjiang province in 2016, hoping that he would be able to emulate these results in Xinjiang on the Uyghur population. And so Chen immediately went to work in 2016, and he created almost Orwellian surveillance states where numerous cameras were implemented on streets everywhere, as shown here. By utilizing what the Chinese government calls an urban grid social management system, he was able to divide the cities of Xinjiang into separate regions for the purpose of social management. As a result, social control over the Uyghurs was now considerably tighter, as government officials now monitored everything that the Uyghurs did as well as their every move. They were able to track facial expressions track where Uyghurs went, track whether or not they left their house, where they were, if they went to use the bathroom or not, anything. And so the minority population was no longer granted the liberty of privacy, and everything they did was now officially documented and reported directly to regional authorities. In addition, Chen also advertised over 90,000 new police-related positions, creating a sort of police state in the region. However, Chen's most shocking policy implementation would come in the form of use of internment camps, which were discovered in 2018 thanks to satellite imagery and leaked documents. After international pressure, the CCP acknowledged the camps formally as vocational education and training centers and claimed that they existed to help the Uyghur population by providing them with the educations and skills necessary to succeed in modern-day China. However, even more than 400 pages of internally leaked documents have been released since 2018, yet the Chinese government remains adamant in denying any wrongdoing. And so on the screen here is a map of over 385 recorded camps that we know today, scattered throughout the Xinjiang province. And these camps are built like prisons with numerous walls and watchtowers surrounding them. Each inmate is monitored 24/7 and has neither any personal freedom nor privacy. And Uyghurs are detained within these camps for reasons ranging from practicing Islam, being critical of the CCP, traveling outside of the country, and even any suspicious behavior. These camps also have a quota to fill, leading the vast majority of detainments to often be unlawful and unjustified. Inside, detainees are forced to renounce Islam and pledge allegiance to the CCP, and anyone who does not obey is punished with beatings and torture. Uyghurs are also held indefinitely and are released at random times, creating a sense of hopelessness and despair within these camps. So with over 1 million Uyghurs now detained within these camps, hundreds of thousands of children are separated from their families. And these children are sent to separate boarding schools, as shown in the picture below, where they are indoctrinated with CCP ideologies and are taught to forget their native tongue as well as their identity as Uyghurs and Muslims. And any sense of individuality is also forbidden. Those who refuse to follow along are quickly faced with physical and emotional punishments and are made examples. And so this erasure of culture within the future generation of Uyghurs, as well as those within internment camps, provides evidence for the cultural genocide that is being perpetuated by the Chinese government. The children are also malnourished and subject to unsanitary conditions, leading to many health problems, even deaths within these schools. On the other hand, Uyghur women are subject to even worse conditions within these camps. They are subject to multiple instances of sexual abuse, rape, torture at the hands of prison guards and outside authority figures. In some cases, Uyghur women are also taken from their rooms and sold to wealthy Chinese men for the purpose of sex, creating a sort of pseudo brothel in these communities. Once they return back to the detention center, they are not allowed to speak of the situation, creating a sense of hopelessness and crushing the spirit of the women within these camps. One ex-detainee tells of a time where all the detainees were made to circle around a Uyghur woman, where she was then gang raped in the middle. As the guards gang raped her, they then looked around to see any sign of discomfort, and anyone who even clenched their fist was then taken and beaten. In addition, the women within these camps are also subject to forced sterilizations at the hands of the CCP. So in 2014, you see the one-child policy being dropped. And so the blue line represents the national number of sterilizations per 100,000 of the population in China, while the orange line represents those of the Uyghur population. And so you see in 2014, ever since the one-child policy gets dropped, you see a massive dip, yet the Uyghur one goes up. And in 2016, after Chen's appointment in the region, you see the sterilization spike once more, further providing evidence of the fact that Uyghur women are being forcefully sterilized. And so this policy only furthers the fact that what the CCP are doing in Xinjiang is not just creating policies of oppression and systematic disenfranchisement, but it's also genocide, as they're forcibly preventing the Uyghur population from continuing to grow. And so many Uyghurs who are also within these camps are sent to factories either within or nearby. In addition, leaked documents released detailed plans for inmates, even those who are formally released from these camps, to take jobs at factories that work closely with the camps to continue to monitor and control them. The socks, suits, skirts, other goods made by these laborers would then be sold into the Chinese market and could then trickle into overseas market, which is a big issue that we see today. After these goods make their way into other locations, entrepreneurs and investors are then able to take advantage of these low prices and profit off of the forced labors within these black factories. Because of this, the Chinese Communist Party is able to continue with these policies and continue to take advantage of the detained Uyghur population for economic gain, in addition to the genocide being perpetuated within the Xinjiang province. And so now when we look at the international response, it's been pretty lacking, honestly, and only Western countries have really moved to condemn the issue, but have yet to take any action. It seems that China's influence within the global sphere has caused many countries to be discouraged from taking any action to help the Uyghur population, which is understandable considering China's current global standing. Now, out of all the countries that have condemned China, the United States has arguably taken the most action, although not enough. Thanks to Joe Biden's forced labor in Xinjiang and Section 307 of the Tariff Act, the U.S. has now banned imports from Xinjiang in order to prevent any semblance of forced labor. And in late December 2021, President Biden also signed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And this culminated in a year-long bipartisan legislative effort in which it implements the presumption that any goods originating from the Xinjiang province were made with forced labor unless the importer can provide clear evidence to the contrary. As a result, customs officials will be authorized to seize goods at U.S. borders. This then puts the responsibility on companies to then make sure that they are not taking advantage of Uyghur people. And by doing so, they're also discouraging companies from continuing to work with factories within Xinjiang under the pretext that their goods could potentially be seized. So in addition, when we look at the Muslim world, we see a massive lack of response. And so one such reason for this is due to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is an initiative that is mainly based in the Xinjiang province and increases trade throughout, obviously, China and Western Europe and almost sort of neo-Silk Road. And so the economic benefit for these Muslim countries is enough for them to obviously not want to condemn any of China's actions. In addition, countries such as Pakistan, which have a close relationship with China, have also accepted the Chinese narrative, which is most likely due to the fact that they would like to maintain aid in their relationship with China. And one other potential reason is the fact that China has now made the issue a lot more political, as opposed to a human rights violation in the first place. So for one, these countries obviously have an anti-West sentiment, and they believe that the U.S. is using the Uyghur issue as a way to push a Western agenda against China and are therefore unwilling to cooperate. And so some potential solutions would be to continue to obviously increase sanctions and tariffs, as well as cut off goods from the Xinjiang province. The United States and other countries could penalize companies that aren't transparent with their intentions and continue to do so until they stop making use of Xinjiang factories and products. The United States could also work with the United Nations Human Rights Council so as to publicly and internationally condemn China and to continue to keep up the pressure. They can also pass resolutions following the United States framework so that the CCP cannot continue to economically benefit from these human rights violations, as well as discourages companies to continue to work with them. The UN can also use their position to prevent the World Bank from providing companies that work within the Xinjiang province and also that work with the Xinjiang province on the outside from receiving loans so as to exert more economic pressure. And the United States, along with other countries that condemn China, should also continue to name and shame these camps as they continue to develop through constantly releasing satellite images and leaked documents to the international community. So with that, I'd like to open the floor to any questions.
The kind of seminal events that really changed the dynamic, the Tiananmen Square you mentioned, 9/11, the riots of 2009. Which of those do you think was the real game changer, the most significant event that changes the Chinese perspective on what they're going to do there?
I would honestly say the most significant change would probably be most likely 9/11, because mainly, obviously, at first there was the Uyghur separatists, right? And so the only reason they were able to pretty much go into the region and continue their oppressive policies was because of the fact that they obviously wanted to punish the separatists for their violent acts. But after 9/11, you start to see this sort of like international pressure against a lot of Islamic extremist groups. And they were able to take that Muslim aspect of the Uyghur people and use that to their advantage. And I feel like by both combining separatism and that extremist aspect, they were able to make their policies even more restrictive and eventually lead to the internment camps that we see today. As well as, honestly, there's also able to avoid a lot of international pressure because at the time, with the United States war on terror, they were doing all these policies under the guise of counterterrorism. So they were able to develop these policies with much of the international community turning a blind eye at the time.
Do you, in your research, did you come across what type of Islam is practiced in the region? Looking at it from the perspective as it's more Sunni versus Shia, but also even schools of thought, it's a much Wahhabist influence there. What did you come across in your research?
Well, granted, Islam practice there is actually really varied. There's obviously a lot of Sunni Muslims, also a lot of Sufi Muslims, which is interesting because obviously there's a big divide between Muslims like globally and worldwide. And there's some Muslims claim that some Sufi Muslims aren't even Muslim because their practices obviously differ a lot from what is, I guess you would call traditional Islam. And so that also might play a factor in why a lot of Muslims have not formally acknowledged the Uyghur people.
Okay. How important, and this is something for, I think, down the road is going to be so vital, and we're already seeing it with Ukraine, the use of satellite imagery in order to document things like atrocities, human rights violations. And this really may have been the first case where you really, maybe Darfur, but this really, I mean, you saw that clear evidence and there was no denying it internationally. I mean, how much of this was a game changer in really pushing the United States and others to condemn China, at least some of the major players?
Okay, well, so like this map that I found online, pretty much if you click on like any of these like small boxes, it shows you like satellite images of like set places. And so not only are there like 385 detention centers, there's also 396 cultural sites and 570 mosques that were destroyed as well, which were captured throughout obviously satellite imagery. I haven't highlighted them for this picture, but still, it's like once you see like these numbers that are literally in the hundreds throughout the entire region, I feel like it puts a lot more like pressure on communities. I feel like it puts a lot more pressure on like communities and champions of human rights to like actually have to like stand up against this. Also, I do feel that, I mean, obviously, while the United States does want to condemn the human rights violations within China, I do feel that the Uyghur issue is also being used a little bit within like a Western agenda, but at the same time, that shouldn't be relevant to other countries because it is still like genocide maybe going on.
And I think you hit this news brief answer for you on this one. Has there been any Muslim countries that have taken a stance against the Uyghurs? Who's been the main spokesperson, if any? Nothing. That's what I thought. It's been pretty much silence. Ms. King.
Good job, Raymond. How much of the general population of China, how much do they know about what's happening with the Uyghurs?
Okay, so it's really interesting because I didn't actually intend to like find that out, but I was watching a lot of like documentaries, right? And so pretty much within like the rest of like mainland China, a lot of people are unaware of this, and those that are aware of the fact that like, you know, obviously like CCP propaganda. And while I was going through like websites and stuff, I found like obviously CCP based sites that were like in Chinese, so I'd like translate them. And essentially they were talking about how it showed like obviously like smiling pictures of Uyghur families and talked about how they were providing them with free education and free labor and these jobs and all this and helping them succeed. And as well, I feel like the way that Han Chinese look at minorities is like very, I guess, how do you say, like tokenized, is that a word?
Mm-hmm.
Almost condescending, I guess, because there's like even like I remember when Genrietta actually came back last year, she was talking about her experience in China, and she was talking about how they had literally apps where you would like take photos and it would like Photoshop on or like filters with like typical like cultural minority outfits on instead. And so it's like they take pride in the fact that China holds this many minorities, when in reality they're obviously like destroying the cultures in the first place.
So kind of as a follow-up to that, we know that China's done pretty much the same thing with Tibet. Do you see any kind of support, at least from Tibet or any other part of China where they've also been oppressed in this way? Or has there been any kind of action that you found from any members of China where they're kind of supporting the Uyghurs?
I feel like it'd be very difficult to find that in the first place.
Yeah.
Because obviously there are like Chinese-based like individuals that are then trying to help the Uyghur people. I feel like it'd be very hard to like discover them unless they're based outside of China.
Yes.
Even in general, the fact that like this has been going on for so long and it's only came up so recently just shows just how good the CCP is at like hiding these policies.
I'll let other people.
Go ahead. I have one more, but I'm gonna let the audience listen to the theme group.
In what ways has Xi Jinping tried to make Han ethnicity synonymous with the CCP party as a whole? And have you seen any slight moves towards any other like minority groups trying to like kind of widen the net, not just from Xinjiang, but more broadly?
Okay, so pretty much talking about how like other minority groups first, like I just want to mention there is another Muslim minority group in China, and you see them, they're called the Hui Muslims, right? And so the whole thing with the Hui Muslims is the fact that they pretty much look, sound, and act like Han Chinese, but they're not essentially prosecuted for Islam, mainly because the brand of Islamic practices become less important and they're more like much more synonymous with the Han population, right? And so we see that obviously like the CCP wants like the Han population to become like the dominant like population in the region, and that they're willing to go through all these acts to make sure that Han Chinese are synonymous with Chinese people in the first place, which already is a big thing. If you talk to anyone about a Chinese person and you ask them, like, do you know what Han Chinese are? A lot of people will say no, but they're already thinking of Han Chinese when they say Chinese. And so the Hui Muslims in general, because they look, sound, and act the same as Han Chinese, they're not prosecuted. And also that population in general has become, I guess, more loyal to the CCP as opposed to their religion. And there's a big sensitization of like their mosque and their brand of Islam, which makes it obviously them less likely to act on, I guess, oppressing that population as opposed to the real Muslims who are ethnically different, speak a different language, look different, and just culturally different in general.
How do you think the like assimilation and eradication of Muslim will take place after these human rights violations have occurred? Do you think it's going to get better or worse for your Muslims?
I'd like to think it gets better, but probably not. Mainly because of the fact that, in general, the population is decreasing in size, mainly due to these forced sterilizations. And so as we see this population on a downward trend, there's also policies where Uyghur women are actually forced to leave their homes and marry Han Chinese men. And so you start to see the mixing of the two populations eventually to a point where eventually in the next couple of decades, I guess Uyghurs will be even smaller than they were before. As Han Chinese continue to pour into the Xinjiang province, I feel like the Uyghurs will slowly start to, I guess, disappear.
How complicit have neighboring countries been to forcing Uyghur refugees to return back to the CCP and ensuring that they will get imprisoned and that they are able to escape the region?
Okay, so in general, in like Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, a lot of Uyghurs are able to escape from there, but they're not exactly safe. Because these governments, depending on the situation, they'll sometimes obviously return these Uyghur refugees. So their best bet usually is to move to Turkey. Because Turkey has a massive community of Uyghur refugees, and the Turkish government doesn't really send these Uyghur Muslims back. But just in general, even once they're outside of the Xinjiang province and they're in the surrounding Kazakh regions, they're still like in danger of being sent back.
I think two of the committee members were on the junior high trip, so again, we had some scheduling issues. Of course, Ms. King here, fill in, so let's get a photo. Let's go back to slide one. Gabrielle.
Yeah. You got it, my question.
Wax, I was gonna ask about turkey next, and you just threw the turkey stuff in, you know, at the end there. So. All right. Make sure my hair is good.
Good job.
That is actually, let's get a solo and then with the family. That was actually that photo he's got up. I almost had that on, that was on the short list for what's in the wall now. That was one I decided not to go with, but that was one. That's such a striking image. All right, family, jump on in. All right.
I was gonna take a. Yeah. Just turn the brightness. Yeah, it's always like on the lowest. So. It's always so low.
Well, hopefully they're looking here. Okay, let me go.
I meant to have it like fully done today.
Good job, guys.
Yes.
Yeah, it'll be easier for
Then when his mom and I get together, there's no getting away with it.
Yeah.
We'll just present it again.
And it'll be on YouTube in a few hours.
Oh, okay.
You can go.
Thank you.
Thank you
Oh,
so much. I appreciate it.
I didn't even, I was worried, I didn't know if you, I didn't see if you show up or not.
But thank you so much for having me. I know.
Thank you again. But he did, you could quit during the process. I'm done with it, but he didn't. And you persevered. So that's oh, no, he's very smooth. He knows the material. So, 3 more days, tomorrow and then Monday and Tuesday. We did everything. We could do it on the books. We want the change on them.
Just click on.
After school time has been strict.
Did he do a good job?
I want to try to do more though.
Thank you so much.
Is that, he's already.
When we're further than $20
Yeah, exactly. I know. What is that? Is that yours?
I don't remember.
In what world?
I'll take a look at my notes.
2 minutes until you're done. Like, I'm giving you a 2-minute warning right now. You understand?
I finished. And it was like flying colors. Red, white, blue. And I was very careful about how. Of course.
You know, you'll be in,
They were actually watching.
you're worried about your senior schedule on the whole. Oh my God, see the
I can still come for questions.
all right.
Good job.
We'll see you tomorrow, man. You got everything?
How do you feel, Ryan?
I'll figure it out.
It's time. When's their last day?
I've always been told that most understanding.
Oh, so you are recording them. What's the latest topic?
Kai, I'll have to get Kai to send it.
Exactly.